At 16, I felt like I knew a lot. I felt like I could make my own choices. And I think that, when I was first thinking of age of consent, I was thinking, like, oh, are we taking away, 16 and 17-year-olds right to choose? Or are we saying you're just children, we have to control you? Because I did really feel pretty grown up. And in fact, a lot of what I was pushing back against was being controlled, even though I moved into being controlled. But one of the things about, the age of consent, that bill is not saying you're going to control a 16 or 17-year-old. You're saying if you're a predator, we're going to control you. Because if you are a certain age, you should not be going after a 16 or 17-year-old.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the executive director of the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, Brenda Stanfill. Brenda moved to Fairbanks when she was 16 years old as a newlywed. Within a few years of arriving, she had 2 children and realized that she had to escape a relationship that, upon reflection, had been abusive from the very start. It was that experience of escaping her own domestic violence situation that has led her to a lifetime of advocacy. Although we discuss Brenda's own story, we also discuss Virginia Giuffre, a victim of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, whose book, Nobody's Girl, was published after her death by suicide in 2025. Visit ANDVSA.org for resources regarding sexual assault and domestic violence. If you are thinking of taking your own life, call 988. Someone is waiting for your call. Brenda Stanfill, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Where did you grow up?
I was born in California, lived in the Modesto area for the first 8 years, and then I moved up to Utah, where I lived in the Ogden area for another 8 years. So, little mixture.
Was your family Mormon?
No, actually, interestingly enough, my father is a Pentecostal minister, so you can only imagine what that was, living in Utah for those years. And I was a little odd person out at the school, That was in the 70s, giving away my age there. Yeah, much different, but no, we were not Mormon.
Why did your family decide to move to Alaska when you were 16?
My family did not. I moved to Alaska when I was 16 because I thought I was all grown up. Kind of led to why I do this work is I left with what I thought was a man at that time, but was really a boy. I was 16, he was 19, and we were gonna get a whole fresh start from a little bit of ongoing trouble. So if you can think about the preacher's daughter, I had to pick the person who, I could save. That's led me to some challenging situations in life, and he was one of them. But I have 2 beautiful children from that and learned a whole lot about what I do now from that real world experience.
So he was like the bad boy at school, and you were attracted to that and ran away from home basically with him, rebelling against your parents in some ways.
Yes, exactly that. I had just, sometimes you just have things you need to prove, and wanted to be very different than my family, even though now I have very much returned in many ways to some, not quite the religious side of it, but in many ways that caring that they taught me. But at that point in time, yes, I was definitely doing the opposites of what they would wish I would be doing.
You don't mind me asking, I had Jeremy Bynum on the podcast fairly recently, and he grew up in a Pentecostal household and shared some of the details of that. Was it a church where people spoke in tongues?
Yes, it was very, I still love the music. I learned to play music during that time, and my mother taught me everything she knew about music, and we sang together and did a lot of things. But yes, it was definitely a Holy Ghost filled, speaking in tongues. We didn't do the snakes. We weren't that far, but a lot of rules, a lot of legalistic type of rules where as a girl, you didn't cut your hair, you didn't wear makeup, you didn't wear pants. Women are somewhat second class. We weren't allowed to do certain things that men could do. And then, no TV, no going to the movies. So just a lot of things that we were not allowed to do. On the flip side of that, I always try to find the things that are good about that. I was a little bit sheltered from some things that could have potentially happened to me. I mean, we're going to talk about the book today, but when I think about the things that I could have been exposed to in my life, I was not. I was protected, and I've always had this amazingly supportive family that has always been my safety net. So that is one of the really great things that came about of having that. I'll call it a cocoon around me a little bit.
How old were you when you started to rebel against that?
Oh, about 14, I met some people that gave me some maybe false courage, if you call it that. And if I ran away, they would let me stay at their home and, where my parents couldn't easily find me. And, I'm a Gen Xer, and we were a little bit wild anyway, and had some freedoms that, kids these days don't really have. You're always spending the night with somebody, and then you could get into all kinds of trouble while your parents thought you were safely tucked away at somebody's house.
So you made it to Alaska when you were 16, very young. I guess you had 2 children fairly soon after.
I did. I had my daughter at 18 and had my son at 21. So rather young mom.
Were you a stay-at-home mom, or what did you do?
I was not. With my daughter, when she was born, my partner at that time was working up on the slope. And so I was able to stay at home with her for about the first 6 months. And then, it was when you have substance abuse and things involved, sometimes there's work, sometimes there's not. Sometimes the substance abuse gets in the way. So I started working about 6 months, and then I've never stopped since then.
Did you do?
Well, at that point in time, I was a waitress, and I feel everyone should at least put some time into the food service industry. Gives you a whole different example of the realities of life, and teaches you how to kind of deal with any situation that you might come across. I was a waitress for many years, and then one day I realized I loved talking to people and loved meeting people. But then one day I realized I didn't want to be friendly that day, but you still have to be friendly. There were some things, and I decided I got to do something different. So I went back to school and, of all things, got my accounting degree and did accounting for many years, and then moved over into being the business manager of the organization that I credit for saving my life when I was going through my domestic violence situation, and then moved on to be their executive director for 25 years.
Then Fairbanks?
That was in Fairbanks, yes.
You've implied, you were in a domestic violence situation. There was substance use involved. And I guess not wanting to go into too much detail, but how long were you in the relationship, and how did you get out?
Well, it's crazy. I always tell people that, I had this tremendous safety net of my parents that would have done anything for me, would have flown me home or whatever. I had a solid childhood, if you look at it in different ways, but it still took me 7 years. Even with all of that, I am a person who is full of hope. And a lot of times when you talk to somebody and you say, what kept them? There's many, many different things. I was just sure that this dream I had and this thing I had set up in my mind was going to ultimately come, because of course, if I can change the world, I could change one person. And realizing that's actually not true, that you can't change people. You can provide assistance and pathways, but they ultimately have to want them. It took me a while to get there. And I remember one time, my sister, who's amazing, she said to me, like, what? Why are you still there? Like, I don't get it. And all I could think was, I'm stupid. Like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. All I know is that right now, I just can't find it in me to leave. There was always something. But ultimately, it was my children that I made the decision to leave for. At that point in time, we didn't know as much about the brain as we do now. And at that time, I thought that my kids were, in a bedroom. They weren't realizing anything that was going on. When I was finally able to find it in me to leave the first time, my daughter was around a year, and that's when I stayed at the shelter program. Someone told me about it. There'd been a lot of things going on. It had gotten very physical, and I needed some protection. And I went to the organization at that time was known as Women in Crisis Counseling and Assistance, later changed its name, but they just did an amazing job, welcoming me in, reconfirming that, I was not alone, that they were here to help me. And they gave me a book called Codependent No More. It was the first time I'd ever heard it. And, for me, we don't want to blame victims for the abuse they're going through. But I also feel it's important. I like to learn about myself. I like to learn through books. And I was able to learn about myself in that way, that there were things that I could do to change that would maybe help me detach from that relationship. I was having a very hard time figuring out how to do that. So that book, I still have that book, and I've read it a couple different times when I feel myself sliding backwards. But they also just said, anytime you need to come talk to us, and I did. I came and talked to them a lot. They helped me reframe things when I would turn it on myself, because oftentimes as victims, we're just like, oh, this is all me. Like, I created the problem. If I could only be this way. And they would help me reframe that to understand that, as I call it, my world was getting smaller, his world was getting bigger. Like, this is not about you. This is about him controlling you. So they ultimately, what led to the day that I left was when my daughter, after a situation had happened, and then my daughter just threw herself against the door when he had left and cried. And I just realized the impact it was having. I just had not realized that. And I thought I have to do it different for my kids, and made that decision that day and went down. They were able to give me some assistance with getting into a place, and had some friends that were able to help me out, and was able to make a change. But that still took me 7 years.
How long after you guys moved from Utah to Fairbanks did you think, oh, I've made a mistake and this relationship is not going the way I thought it was going to go?
Interestingly, the relationship wasn't going the way I thought it would go before I came to Alaska. And oftentimes I think we think a change of location, a change of scenery, a change of friends, that's all going to solve it. So I really had figured that coming up here would be a brand new start in Alaska, and that we would just miraculously be different people, that we would get it all together, and we were, going to have this life that I had pictured.
You graduated from high school already at 16?
No, I had not. I had to go back and do things a bit the hard way. After my daughter was born, my mom came up to visit me. I went over and took my GED in one day to get it done, and got that done. So, but yes, I had not completed high school.
You said left him the first time when your daughter was a year old, and then ultimately you got out after 7 years, which, was that when you were 23?
Yeah, I was 22. We had been together for a year before I came to Alaska.
Got it.
Yeah.
I guess one last question just about that first year out when you got away. Were you ever tempted to go back? Did he try to regain contact with you?
Yeah, the many times that I had left before, I would resolve to be done each time. And then there would be something that would pull me back, whether that would be that I thought, oh, the kids need him. So, my daughter was very attached to him. Sometimes it was that. Sometimes it was just like, I don't want to be alone. Sometimes I was struggling. When I found out I was pregnant with my son, we were actually split up at that point in time. And then it was like, how am I going to go through this alone? So there was always kind of this something that came up. And so when I left for the last time, I don't know that I knew it was for the last time. I think because each time I tried to have that resolve, I tried to be done. But this time, I think with just the support of the people around me and things coming together. This is why I'm just such a firm believer in housing, because in the times before, I couldn't find anywhere to be. And there's only so much time you can stay in a shelter without just losing your mind. It's community living. Everyone has different parenting styles. No one moves into a shelter to say, let me live here for my life. You're there, you're displaced. You've got a small space for your stuff. And then I would stay with a friend. Well, that's always difficult too, because you're imposing on people and they're trying to move their lives around. And so oftentimes that would be the reason I went back, is I just couldn't find a place to live. So this time, actually, the place to live lined up. And that made all the difference in the world, that I then had my own apartment. And so when he did come back and start talking about reconciliation or whatever, I would have had to give up my apartment because it was a subsidized apartment. He wasn't allowed to live there. So I could use that as the reason he couldn't move in when he didn't have housing. So there was just some things that came together that allowed me to have that strength and to be able to say no when I needed to say no, to be able to continue and do it on my own. I do feel like that individuals who have the need to control and use abuse are always going to come back one way or another. And, his coming back was always in a I need you mode. It wasn't the violent mode after I would leave. Many do it differently. Many are like, I'm going to scare you into coming back because it's going to be safer for you to be with me than not. I didn't experience that, which I'm so grateful for. He also did not give me a hard time about the kids, which I see so many people going through these just terribly long custody battles. He was fine with me having, custody of the kids, and he would see them when he wanted to, and that worked out okay for that period of time. He did ultimately move out of Alaska, and then, things were shifting. But definitely during those first couple of years after we split up, he still was involved in my life.
You talked about this with your kids as adults about that period, and what have they expressed to you about those early years of their childhood?
Well, it was so hard. One day I said something very negative about him in front of my daughter when my mom was there. And she really got me. And she said, that is half of your child. That is half of your child. So how do you?
Said that.
My mom did. And my mom came from a divorced home and I did not. And so my mom had experienced that firsthand about how she felt when something was said about her biological dad. Even though her biological dad was not always there for her, she wanted to feel good about him. She wanted to feel proud about him. And my kids were little when my mom said that. And it really caught my attention. And I can't say that if I did it right or wrong. I know they got that list of here's the things, Mom, you could have done better or whatever. But I did try. I would just always say, he's a long ways from here. Why doesn't he call? Well, he's a long ways from here. And sometimes it's hard to have those distant relationships. I would just try to make it where they always felt loved, even if he wasn't there. And then when they got older, they themselves decided to go meet him. And then they themselves learned some things about him. And then it took me a long time to actually tell my story. I was working as the executive director of the shelter for about 10 years. And a reporter came to talk, and I shared my story with her. And then she said, can I print this? And I said, oh, I've never told my kids. And at that point in time, my kids were a bit older. And so before that story printed, I did talk to the kids and said, it wasn't always good. I mean, this is the reason I do this work. And I gave them, I've never given them details of anything. That would just be a lot, for them to hold. But that there were situations that we faced. And then also, as I've learned more and I think about his history himself, how did he become the person that he was? He didn't come from any kind of good stuff. There was ongoing abuse that he watched. He shared stories with me early on about the abuse he watched his father do to his mother. He was patterning what he knew. He was patterning how to handle conflict. He was patterning how to control his world when it felt out of control. And then you add in the substance abuse and the drug use on top of that. And so when the situations would get out of hand, it would get very ugly. And so my kids know enough to know why I do this work. And I feel like that's enough, for them to know. And then also for them to remember, why it's so important that we learn skills as we go, because I think all of us can resort to things that we're not proud of, and we have to continually be working on ourselves. We have to be okay going back and saying, I screwed that up, I'm going to do better, and then commit to doing better. So yeah, they know just enough.
How long have you been the executive director of the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault?
I'm coming up on 5 years that I've been here at the network. I've been involved in the policy area and down here in the state legislature through my membership in the network for 25 years, and then was just really blessed that when this position opened up, I was ready to do something a little bit different, and this was just perfect.
For folks who've never heard of it, What is the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault?
So we are a membership organization, and we have 24 direct service agencies throughout Alaska that provide those on-the-ground supports to people just like me. When I was coming in, that shelter I came in was one of our member programs. And what we do is we support them in whatever way we can. So during legislative session and off legislative session, we're looking at policy, we're looking at laws that are impacting survivors in a way that is wrong or right, or we look at different things that we need to change. We look at things that we need to be doing in the custody arena. How can we change civil laws in order to make it better? And then just policies, for instance, policies around housing. When you do a credit check on somebody who's been in a domestic violence situation, it's probably terrible. But so how do we make sure that our public housing isn't doing credit checks and holding that against survivors and not letting them into housing? So what can we do in every facet of the system to make it better? So that's one of our primary purposes. The other thing we do is that we offer training and technical assistance to our programs. A lot of times they don't have time to learn about all the latest laws or all of the things that they need to know. And then the other thing we do is direct services. So we do some direct services in our legal program. So we have attorneys that work on staff, and then we also have a whole bunch of pro bono attorneys out there that take on cases for free. And then we have some people who take on cases, some attorneys take on cases, but they reduce their fee greatly. And so we can get maybe a custody case for $6,000 that would normally cost $75,000. We found that one of the areas that survivors just really lose is in the custody and divorce if they don't have representation. So we try to make sure, and that's a statewide program. All of our member programs can refer to us, and we take as many as we possibly can. Then our last little part we do is prevention. And I call it a little part, but it's such an important part because we know that if we don't really start upping our work in the prevention area across the state of Alaska, that we are not going to solve this issue. We're not going to bring our rates down. We just finished a strategic plan last year, and we're working with the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault to figure out, how can we get the funding to start making this happen across the state in those prevention areas. Prevention looks like a lot of things. I mean, you can go into the early childhood. We know that people coming into the home early, like home nursing, can make a real difference because you're coming into the home, you're seeing what's happening. And again, like those people who helped me, I did not know what I didn't know. I was in this situation. I was in over my head. I had no clue what was happening. I didn't even know the word domestic violence. I didn't know any terms. I just knew that this kept happening, and it must be something I was doing that was making him act that way, because he didn't act that way anywhere else except for at home and with me. And he's like the greatest guy to all his friends, and everybody loves him, and I don't know what's happening. So, home nursing can come in and be there with a newborn. We know that that's a time where during pregnancy, after pregnancy, abuse can escalate. They can be there in the home. They can see things. Also, mentorship, being able to have a coach or someone around you who you can see like, hey, there's something different over here. They can help you. We know that coaches as mentors can be huge. And that's why we do things like Girls on the Run, which is really bringing girls in, teaching them about, empowerment, making sure that they're proud to be a female, because sometimes it can feel heavy, especially in sports, where sometimes there's a discounted type of thing that happens in sports and women's sports. And, kids will share things. And so, kind of being able to have those conversations with kids when something happens, it also gives you an opportunity to be able to work with the systems that are there to protect children. The more eyes we have on them. And sometimes while our child protective services, they are able to step in and get a family involved in services. It's not always removal of the family, but oftentimes they say, hey, batter's intervention program costs some money, but we can pay for that. Let's send you over here to make sure that you've learned these skills, because if I've never learned emotional intelligence, I've never through my lifetime learned how to control my actions, then it very well may be that that's where I go when I'm angry. And so some work on emotional intelligence, that's your primary prevention. And then you also have, what we call tertiary prevention is like I talked about. Let's make sure there's housing. like if there's housing, we had a person who was going through a batter's intervention program, and she was saying, please don't put him in jail. And, like really doing this push, like don't prosecute going through. But really when you drill down and work with her, it's because she had no money to pay the rent. And when we said, hey, if we could pay the rent for 6 months, would you be pushing back on him being held accountable for what he did to you? And she said, no, but how am I going to pay the rent? So it's all these areas that we've got to put together in order to make sure that when someone is ready to leave, or somebody who's experiencing that as a child can have those avenues to either learn what a new normal could be, or to be able to break out of that and have their needs met, not end up homeless. That's a terrible thought for a woman and children, is how am I going to live on the streets or in my car?
So one of the reasons why you're on the show today is you had recommended Nobody's Girl, a memoir of surviving abuse and fighting for justice by Virginia Roberts Giuffre. And I'll just say, as a way of introduction, that I have not been somebody who's followed the Epstein scandal. I watched the news, so it had come up for 15 years. I mean, he's been in the news or longer. But I'm so grateful to have read the book, because I learned so much, and it kind of really puts it all together, so that now as I watch the news, it means something completely different to me. Can you talk a little bit about how you read the book and what it's meant for you?
I had listened to a podcast early on when the world shut down and we were all in seclusion, and I discovered podcasts, and then I started just listening all the time. And I had listened to a 6-part series they had done on the Epstein situation, and heard different things. And so I was aware of it, but like you, even though what we do, you would think we would be tuned into it. I think that what I'm recognizing is that domestic violence and sexual assault and sex trafficking are connected, but we hadn't connected them. And we're still working on how to do that. And so it was a little bit to the side. But when I listened to that podcast, and then when I was, seeing things in the news, I don't think anybody ever really connected the dots to me about the depth of what happened. And so when this book came out, and she had just recently taken her life, it changed my perspective. And you have sometimes in life those things that you just pick up and all of a sudden you are a different person. That was this book to me. And I have to be honest, it was a hard read. There were times I had to set it down and walk away for a couple of days, because my nervous system, like I can't even imagine what this young girl then growing into a young lady and aging up into our adult system. And then you think about, like, I go back and I think, oh, that seemed like a lifetime, but it was, how much she endured in 3 and 4 years of that. And so I really, after reading this book, it has really opened my eyes to what we're exposing our youth to, especially if you think about the number of, youth that are served by like Covenant House in Anchorage, or the Door in Fairbanks. Fairbanks Native Association has a program called SOAP. They're working with these youth, and if they don't even have the ability to get any housing. Again, what are we doing in order to ensure that people survive? What choices are they having to make in our society in order to survive? And it really brought home to me so much in reading this about what our youth who don't have that safety net. I've always had that safety net. I could have gone home. That's not her home was abuse. And so it wasn't that there's a safe place for me to land. There was no safe place for her to land.
I want to talk about her age. She was 16 when she was working at Mar-a-Lago, and Ghislaine Maxwell first took her to Jeffrey Epstein's mansion. And you had spoken to me about how the book really changed your feelings about age of consent. And I can't help but think that you were 16 when you moved to Alaska So I don't know if like your own personal experience had shaped you in some way, then the book sort of shifted your thinking.
I think you're right. Again, at 16, I felt like I knew a lot. I felt like I could make my own choices. And I think that, when I was first thinking of age of consent, I was thinking, like, oh, are we taking away, 16 and 17-year-olds right to choose? Or like are we saying you're just children, we have to control you? Because I did really feel pretty grown up. And in fact, a lot of what I was pushing back against was being controlled, even though I moved into being controlled. But one of the things about, the age of consent, that bill is not saying you're going to control a 16 or 17-year-old. You're saying if you're a predator, we're going to control you. Because if you are a certain age, you should not be going after a 16 or 17-year-old.
A couple of things that I think the book really made concrete. She was sexually abused by her father starting at age 7. He began trafficking his daughter to his best friend when she was 9 or 10. That abuse from her father and best friend stopped when she was about 13, but then she was raped by 2 older teenagers when she was 14. And I think she writes about it in the book that when Ghislaine Maxwell saw her, that Ghislaine Maxwell had sort of this sort of sixth sense for not only seeing a young girl that Jeffrey Epstein would find attractive, but a young girl who was broken in some way and was more likely to go along with the type of abuse that they would inflict.
That is true. And, it has been something I've tried to think through and figure out. Oftentimes we would be working with a mom who was sexually abused and then her daughter who was sexually abused. And, is there maybe something that dulls? Oftentimes, I think, especially as women, we try to think like, what can I change about me? What can I do? And somebody said the other day, they read a quote and it was like, glad I avoided being the victim. I feel sorry for the next person he got. Like we can wrap ourselves in all of these things. We can learn new skills. But I do think predators are watching for certain things. I mean, we just had that rape academy. Like they share this information. We don't know that maybe we were too open with our personal life right off. Maybe there's something that we shared about us, oh gosh, I'm between homes right now. Those little key things that they're listening for, they're picking up on. And then once they recognize that you have these little gaps that they can weasel in, I think they're watching for people. And somebody I don't think that we ooze it. I don't think there's a certain look on our face, but I think they're listening to everything that an individual does. And then they pick up on it. Oftentimes, we talk about red flags. We talk about things that you should be concerned about, those kind of things, but not everything shows up in a red flag. And, in my own experience, when I came, and again, I was working as a waitress. I worked at the airport coffee shop in Fairbanks, and it was quite the happening place. We had people that were regulars there. And one of the men came in every day. And one day he brought me a little necklace and had a little bit of gold nugget on it. And he's like, you just look like you're having a tough day. And I was thinking about you the other day and just wanted you to know how much I appreciate what you do. And, gave me this little tip of this necklace. And it was pretty nice. And I didn't have that much nice stuff, And then, he'd come in and sometimes he would leave me $100 tip for, a $5 meal. And then one day he told me about these parties they have up north. And if I wanted to go to one of these parties, they pay girls $400 a night. You just go up on a Friday night, come back on a Saturday, and it's just these parties they have up north. There's a bunch of men up there. They don't have anything going on, so they just host a party. You just go up there, dance, have a good time. And I am 16 and I'm struggling. And I say, wow, like I love to dance. Like that sounds amazing. Like it's just a Friday night. And he's like, yep, we do it twice a month and we'd love to have you join in. And, luckily I had some friends that are like, hey, I don't know that, that doesn't sound right. And I'm like, but that would be great. I mean, that would be so much fun. And we just go, and, then it was a no. Like all my friends around me are like, no, you're not doing that. We're not going to let you go. years later, I discovered that man's name was Bruno, and he was one of the big traffickers in town. We didn't call it trafficking then. We called it pimps and prostitutes, but he was bringing girls up. He would provide them housing. He would give them all the things they needed. And for many, many years, the troopers tried to catch that guy. And there was a couple of women that we kept in our shelter in order to try to keep them safe, and they disappeared. We don't know what happened to them. And ultimately, they got him for ATM, doing something wrong with his ATM, and they were able to get him that on federal charges and put him away for quite a while, but never could get him on the trafficking because it was so hard. But I think about that, and I think at 16, I was so impressionable, and that probably would have happened. Maybe the first time I just would have danced. Maybe the second time some alcohol or some drugs were involved. Maybe something would have happened and then I'm ashamed. And I'm not going to tell my husband what happened because now I'm really ashamed, but then I'm even stuck more. And so like, how do these things happen in a way that by the time, we're so far in, we don't even know how to get out. And I just read that through this whole book is that she went into it with a dream. And then she had no clue how to extricate herself from that.
One of the heartbreaking parts is, there's a lot of emphasis on how Jeffrey Epstein preferred inexperienced younger teenagers. And so, a lot of those girls, this was like their first sexual experiences, these terrible experiences. But when they were trying to prosecute Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, one of the defenses that they used was that these were prostitutes. Basically, they just defamed them, saying that they were alcoholics, drug addicts, prostitutes, even though they were 15 and 16 years old. And it's just a really, really, it's just all very sad. And I think about Florida has a consent of 18. And so these were crimes. Like when Megyn Kelly, I guess last year, did her infamous defense that Jeffrey Epstein wasn't a pedophile because these weren't children. They were 16 and 17-year-olds.
When my daughter was 16, there was a young man who was coming around who was 22, 23, and he just kept wanting to date her. And my daughter and I have a very good relationship. And I said to her, honey, he doesn't want you for your brain. And I think that's the thing about this is that she didn't have the ability to understand that. And so the way that they preyed upon these young girls who did not have the ability to understand that. So, you're saying that this is not pedophilia, but you're still working with a person who's got a child brain. There's no frontal lobes there. There's still so much connecting that's going to happen. And so, granted, maybe they have some development that has happened, but it is still ultimately preying upon a person who does not have the ability to know what you're doing. That the difference in the mental capacity is great at that point in time.
Another epiphany I had in the section towards the end when during the first deposition of Ghislaine Maxwell, when she is basically being questioned about having trafficked Virginia Giuffre for over 2 years, she kind of makes the point that like she was never chained up, she was never handcuffed, she was never a prisoner. And I think, you do hear those like horror stories of people locked in closets, but the truth is Virginia Giuffre had her own apartment and a boyfriend and went home, and like would stay at her apartment for a couple of weeks. And then she would go back and travel with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell to exotic locations for a couple of weeks and then come back and then go to her apartment. And so I think that was a big epiphany for me that like, it is not being locked in a closet. It was the desperation of thinking that there was going to be a light at the end of this tunnel. There was opportunity for her as somebody who came from a very poor background, abusive background, that she would be able to get money, education. Those promises were coming from Epstein and Maxwell. And I just thought that that was an important thing to learn, that just because she could go to her own apartment didn't mean that she wasn't being sex trafficked.
Yeah. And that's very true that we oftentimes want to think of it as the, somebody came over from a different country and they're being treated in these deplorable ways. The thing about that is that, manipulation, coercive control, the way that people can manipulate your thinking, they're very good at it. It's an art. It's a skill that people work at in order to be able to manipulate the way that people engage and see this world. And, once they identified how much she wanted to be the massage therapist. So there was always this thing they dangled over, and she was always seeing, okay, well, a couple of years, and then I can move over into doing this thing I want to do. But the dangling kept leaving. And, you think about in the business world, they call it that sunk cost. Like, I got so much invested already. Like, how do I just walk away? What do I do? Like, I don't like this. This is uncomfortable. And then the further into it, that, when I was reading it, I was thinking the further she got into it, the further she was away from any kind of being able to do it on her own anymore. Again, over time, she no longer had that apartment. She no longer had that ability to just go. Like, they slowly pulled her into where they were for orbit. I think there was one part in the book where they were like, oh, we acted like we were her mom and dad.
He talked about that a lot, about how anyone who saw the three of them together would assume that those were her parents, and the way they were interacting with her were like parents.
And they were caring for her in many ways. And if you think about it, Jeffrey Epstein was doing the same thing her father had done. And so again, like, how much of our conditioning as very young do we carry with us into adulthood? And that while feels wrong, it also feels normal.
You have spoken a little bit about it, that there is something even more sad about the memoir because it is after she died by suicide. And there was, the big rescue in the book is her meeting her husband when she's in Thailand at massage school that she finally got sent to by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. But as you and I pointed out, there's a lot of red flags. She basically agreed to marry him after only knowing him for a week. And he was like a mixed martial arts fighter in Thailand, originally from Australia. And the book does say that they had a lot of unhappy times and there was drug use and alcohol. So I don't know that it's necessarily a huge surprise that there was also abuse present that's not mentioned in the book. But it is sad to know that she really didn't escape her abusive past.
It was, you wanted so much reading it after it had already happened. And so, that as she meets him and the ending of the story already, I did find that I was looking more for those red flags. I think oftentimes we read those books and, all of a sudden, I'll just say as women, Prince Charming comes along and then here's this person, he's going to change your life. And a lot of times we're conditioned for that. I think we're getting better at it now. We're not really conditioned to be like, hey, here's how you stand on your own 2 feet. Here's how you get a really good job. Here's how you decide if you want to engage in a relationship or not. In my generation, it was an expectation that you were going to get married and have children. That was just the expectation. That has changed, but I do believe that she also wanted so much to have that dream. And again, when you're full of hope, I see her as a woman who, again, is controlling her world, even though it's totally controlling her. In her mind, she is finding ways to control her world. She's full of hope that there is going to be a light at the end of the tunnel. I could see her very much doing that same thing with her relationship, is that I'm going to make this relationship be the absolute best. I'm going to tell myself it's the absolute best. I've made these choices and I'm going to figure out how to stick with it and to stay in with it. And then again, once the kids come along, you've got children, you've got all these other things. And then where does she go? All of a sudden, Ghislaine Maxwell calls her and says, hey, make sure you're not talking, and I'm sure, like, where would she have gone? If she had left him, where would she have gone? She doesn't have a supportive family. She's not going to go back to that life. She doesn't want to go back to that life. She has children. He knows things about her that could impact custody. And what does she do?
And if I were to say one more very disturbing part of the book is, if there's sort of like the original crime. It was her father molesting her at age 7 and then for the next 6 years. And her almost obsession with trying to repair her relationship with her father, flying him to Australia, him behaving terribly every time they interacted. And there's just part of it, it's like, why is she doing this? For me, yes, her mother did not protect her child. So her mother definitely carries responsibility, but she wasn't obsessed in the same way with repairing the relationship with her mother. And that really bothered me.
Yeah. To me, I think that's where, professional therapy is what really can come in and help you sort that out. Again, like that statement I made when my sister said, "Why do you stay?" And I'm like, I don't know. I'm stupid. Like, I don't know. Like, again, was it where she could gain control of the relationship? Was there something in her that's like, if I repair this, then I can be in control of it. I can be the one who decides how this relationship looks. I mean, we don't know exactly what pushes our brain until somebody can sit down with us and help us sort through it to figure that out. It was hard to read. You wanted her to just say, like, kick him to the curb.
Well, there's a listener in Alaska who is a victim of sexual assault or trafficking or is in a domestic violence relationship. What's their first step of getting help?
Well, oftentimes we will talk to a trusted friend, we'll talk to a parent if we have one. And then at some point in time, like my sister was my person, and then she started saying, "I don't get it. Why are you there?" And then I felt judged, and then I felt kind of shamed, and then I felt stupid, even though she didn't mean that. She was just trying to get me to wake up and see. But oftentimes what happens as the relationship, as the control grows and the isolation, you isolate more and more where your world gets much smaller. What I tell people is that reaching out to someone who does not know you, it can be the most impactful thing you could do. And so I loved the advocates at the domestic violence. Oftentimes we call them shelters, but some of them don't have a shelter, but they always have an advocate there. At the organizations that are throughout Alaska, they all have 1-800 numbers. So it doesn't matter where you are. You can get one of those. You can ANDVSA.org. We have a whole list of all of those and how to contact them. Go straight to their website. But connect with someone who does not judge you, who you can be brutally honest with. The other wonderful thing about confidentiality and privilege is you can be brutally honest with them, and share all the ugly things you did. One time he was passed down on the floor and, I just kicked him 3 or 4 times, like really hard. And that was not right. But I shared that, and then they helped me understand how your brain works and you reach that point and other things that I could do. But I could just be brutally honest about how ugly maybe sometimes I was in this relationship. And then they could help me frame that in a way that I would quit blaming myself, because I just kept blaming myself. Oftentimes that is what is happening with people who are experiencing abuse. They keep turning on it like it is you. So I would say reach out and make that phone call. You can give a fake name. You don't even have to tell them who you really are. Like you just make up a name. You could say you're calling for a friend and your friend keeps sharing these things with you, but just connect with someone. Don't ever stop talking about it, because when you stop talking about it and you stop trying to figure it out, you will just shrink and shrink and shrink until you just can't see your way out. So I'm just saying, just make a phone call. Nothing better than a stranger with no judgment to be able to really talk to and lay it all on the line. And the next time you go to family dinner, nobody knows. They're also not going to judge that person. Many times when you have not decided if you're ready to leave yet, and then you tell your mom, and then you show up at family dinners the next time, it can be really awkward. So that also, being able to talk to somebody who can help you, who can provide some resources to you. Also, when you are ready to leave, they have access to things like what we call the E-CHIP voucher. It's a special voucher program for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault that is operated through those programs throughout Alaska. They can help you get a place that's subsidized, that you can move out. They can oftentimes help you with some of the core things that you need. They can help you with emergency transportation. So if you are in this and you've been thinking about what do I do next, make contact with a local program. Or if you don't want to talk to a local program, call an unlocal program. You can call anyone in the state, any of those programs. So if you might be in Fairbanks and you want to talk to somebody in Anchorage, call the Anchorage program and talk to them. And that way you won't accidentally come across anyone you know if you are using your real name. Or again, just use whatever name you want to use. But don't stop talking to people. Don't internalize this to a point that all of a sudden you just cannot find your way out. Suicide is real for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault when it gets to the point that they just can't hold the load. And so I would just say, don't hold this alone. There are people out there that will help you. And they're there 24 hours a day. So whether it's 2:00 that you really need to talk to somebody, 2:00, they're there. They're answering the phone. Please don't hold this. Please share and please connect where we can help in whatever way we can to find a way through this.
Brenda Stanfill, thank you so much for being on the show today. And that's ANDVSA.org, where folks can find the phone numbers for the shelters in their area if they want to call, or advocates elsewhere. And if someone is thinking of taking their own life, they can call 988.
Yes, please. Yes.
Hey, is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you wanted to talk about?
I don't think so. This was great. And I just really appreciate that we had this opportunity to really talk today. And I would encourage anyone, if you have not read Nobody's Girl, it is really a life-changing experience, and realizing why we need to think about this and our kids. This impacts our kids.
Thank you for being on the show. I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-465-4940.